words. He says, "At my first answer, no man stood with me, but all men forsook me. I pray, God, that it may not be laid to their charge. Nevertheless, the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, and that by me the preaching might be fully known, and that all the Gentiles might hear. And I was delivered out of the mouth of lions." And so Paul relates to us an experience that he had in his life, that there was a point in his life that no person stood with him. And yet, though no person stood with him, God did. God was on his side not only to help him, but to deliver him. Like moving day, where's all the helpers, right? So pretty soon, I remember this guy telling this story about going for missions. He said, his son was a missionary, and they go to various churches. Some missionaries spend 2-3 years going to churches to get their support. And he said they go to certain churches and they say, "Brother, we're behind you. We're behind you. We're behind you all the way." And he says, pretty soon they're so far behind you can't even see them anymore. So, but anyway, I know how you can keep distance from someone. You know how that is? It's a new diet. I don't know if you heard about this. It's called the garlic diet. You actually don't lose any weight, but people stand farther away and you look smaller. But sometimes, we think that people are behind us. But when it comes to standing with us in adversity, Paul says, "Here I was, and I looked around, and I looked this way and that way, and I looked behind me. And guess what? There was nobody there. There was nobody there to support me when I needed support." Maybe the psalmist felt like that one day when he said, "No man cared for my soul." I don't know if you ever feel like that. You feel like you're all alone and it's just you and God. And sometimes when it's just you and God, you know what? That's the majority. If God is on your side, guess what? That's the majority. Sometimes we look about us and we say, "You know what? Where is the help? Where are those friends that I thought were my friends? Where are those people that are there to support me?" You begin to look around and they're not there. Paul said, "I began to look around, and guess what? No man, not some men, no man stood with me." But he says, that was all right. Nevertheless, he says, "The Lord stood with me." Really, he begins this psalm by emphasizing the mercy of God. The mercy of God here in the Old Testament is God's loving kindness. And here we have the psalm which was sung again at Israel's festival times where they were gathered together to worship in the temple. And the reason we know this is because there's a repetition of the same phrases. So again, all the psalms are songs, and so we see this is a public worship, and there's the repetition of phrases that he uses. In worship, again, there was a recognition of God's mercy in verses 1 through 4. He says, "Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endureth forever. Let Israel now say that his mercy endures forever. Let the house of Aaron now say that his mercy endureth forever. Let them now that fear the Lord say that his mercy endureth forever." Notice he says something about the mercy of God or the loving kindness of God. What does he relate when it comes to the mercy or the loving kindness of God? He uses the same phrase in all 4 of these verses. It is the fact that his mercy endures how long? How long does your mercy exceed to? Until someone agitates us enough and we're done with them, right? When does your mercy run out, right? How many levels of mercy do you have, Where's your line of mercy? It's here, right? Here's the line. Don't cross over this line. Here's the carpet was put together here. So I'm going to tell you right now, you see the line here? It's here, okay? Don't cross over this line. Because you cross over this line, you know what's going to happen? No mercy, okay? But guess what? We've crossed over the line many times, right? And God's loving kindness and mercy doesn't end. It keeps going. And he says that this mercy that is bestowed upon us is an everlasting and eternal mercy. It is his loving kindness which is demonstrated to us. And the recognition, he says, by these different groups. Let the house of Israel say, his mercy endures forever. Let the house of Aaron, the priesthood, say that his mercy endures forever. Let those that fear the Lord, those that are non-Jewish and have committed themselves to the God of Israel, say that his mercy endures forever. When does God's mercy run out? It never runs out. It's an everlasting mercy, which he tells us here. And because of that mercy, we see that that mercy plays out in everyday life. Really where the rubber meets the road, the everyday life of Monday through Friday, the grind of life. It is the nasty now and now that we see the mercy of God. And really, as we consider our week, is there any time of this week where there was some bumps in the road, where there's some distress along the way? How about maybe that nowadays, you can call someone and you don't have the same courage to tell them on the phone what you want to tell them. So guess what? You fire off a nice hot text, right off the griddle. It's so hot that you gotta put some protection on your hands to hold your phone, right? And you start reading this thing, and it can really upset your day, right? It can rock your day. Or maybe even talking with that individual, or rubbing shoulders with an individual alters the day. I mean, a day can be altered with a little contact that we have with one person. Maybe a driver on the road, maybe another member of our family, maybe someone we encounter that day, and all of a sudden, guess what? That joyful, peaceful day that you woke up with vanishes, and now you are in the nasty now and now, where the rubber hits the road. And really, that's where mercy meets us on the road of life. He says this mercy extends to our everyday experiences of life. When's the last day you had a good day? When's the last day you had a bad day? When's the last day you had a good day mixed with a bad day? Probably every day, right? It seems like there's something every day that comes our way that, as they say, upsets the apple cart. But anyway, those days come, and those days must be gone through. And so we go through those days and those weeks, and we really rely upon the mercy of God. Here we have his mercy displayed, working out in everyday life. Okay, his mercy is just not something that we go to the temple with 3 times a year and say, hey, God, yeah, you're merciful. No, this mercy works in everyday life. This is Monday through Friday stuff. This is the weekend stuff. This is every day of life, the good times, the bad times, the days of working, the days of holiday, whatever it might be. This stuff works all the time. It's something that you can take with you every day of your life. You don't have to park it on some shelf or can it there somewhere and try to find it when you need it. No, you need it probably almost every day. It is God's loving kindness which he displays to us. And here he starts in this verse, he says in verse 2, he begins again with the mercy of God that endures forever. And then here's where the mercy hits everyday life. Verse 5. I will call upon the Lord in distress. The Lord answered me and set me in a large place. The Lord is on my side, I will not fear. What can man do unto me? The Lord taketh my part with them that help me. Therefore shall I see my desire upon them that hate me. And so he begins verse 5. He says, I called upon the Lord in distress. In distress. I mean, you know what distress is? I'm sure none of you have ever faced any distress in your life at all, right? None at all. I mean, you guys are walking on clouds. I saw you walk in this morning that was on a cloud. And distress is absolutely not a part of your life. I'm probably speaking a foreign language to you this morning, and I should probably have an interpreter up here telling you what I'm actually saying. So I'm sure you don't know anything about distress in your life. But if you do, here's some practical advice. The psalmist says, in my distress. What did you do in your distress? Called Paul. That didn't work. So I called Matt. That didn't help. What do we do, right? What do you do in distress? What do you do in distress? Where do you go when you are distressed? He says there's a place to go. Do you ever notice that when you're distressed, it's hard to pray? When you're overwhelmed with distress, sometimes it's hard to get those words out of your mouth because of what you're going through. And so where do you go when you find yourself in distress? Distress has the idea of being in straitness or in a narrow place. It has the idea of being confined, or we understand the phrase, we're boxed in. And so here's what the psalmist says when he found himself in distress. In my distress I called, and he answered. In my distress, even though it might be hard to formulate those words in prayer, in my distress I called, and he answered. Notice what he says in verse 5. I called upon the Lord in distress, and the Lord answered me. I called upon the Lord in distress, and the Lord answered me. An amazing thing to consider, that God answers our prayers, not only that he hears, but that he answers them as well. David says in Psalm 18, verse 6, in my distress I called upon the Lord and cried unto my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him even into his ear. What do you do in distress? He says, in distress, the psalmist said, I called. I called upon the Lord, and what did the Lord do? He answered me. In Psalm 18, he says, in my distress I called upon the Lord, and my voice came before him, even into his very ear. You always have a listening ear. So when your wife says, are you listening to me? Just keep shaking your head, pretending you're getting it all in. Are we always listening? No, we don't always listen, or we listen partly, right? But hey, we have the ear of God. And when we have the ear of God, you know what? He's not listening partially. We have his full attention. He hears us. We are speaking directly into the very ears of God. And when you speak directly into the ears of God, you know that little whisper, it can be as little as a whisper. God can hear that whisper, and he answers that prayer. Amazing. It's amazing that God, the God of the universe, wait, think of this for 1 minute. It is the God of the universe that he would be concerned about you and me. That he would be concerned about the things that touch us or move us or shake us or distress us. That God would be concerned. Doesn't God have better things to do than mess with my little world? No, he's interested in your world, our little world. He's interested in the things that touch us. He says, for we have not an high priest which cannot be what? Touched with the feeling of our infirmities, our weaknesses. For he was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore do what? Come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. The next thing we see in this passage of Scripture is, in my distress he set me in a large place. He set me in a large place. So in distress, we find ourselves boxed in by the circumstances or situation that we find ourselves in. We find ourselves in a straight way or confined by these things that are in our life. But notice what God does. He not only hears in verse 5, but he also says, he set me in a large place. Distress puts us in a narrow place. It confines us, in a sense, to a box. We have no answer. We have no solution. And then all of a sudden, God comes along, and what does he do? He opens up the doors and lets us go free. He puts us in a large place. So in my distress, he set me in a large place. He opened the doors to my boxed-in, confined, narrow place. He brought relief to my distress. He brought relief to my distress. Those times, again, those 2 or 3 times that you wake up in the middle of the night and you're overwhelmed by your problem, maybe that sleepless night or those night terrors that come upon you because of some situation that you're facing, he has brought relief. He has set me in a large place. He sets you free from your fears, or it sets you free from your fenced-in problems of life. You know what the problems of life seem to do? They seem to build some fences that you can't get on the other side of. They seem to box you in, and all of a sudden God comes along and he breaks down the fence, and all of a sudden you find yourself in open pastures. You find yourself in a large place. And that is what God does in your distress. He brings in another, we could say it in another term, which is he brings relief. He brings relief. When you are in distress, God brings relief. He opens it up so you can experience relief. When you are confined to that thing that is bothering you, that is weighing you down, you're fenced in, you're boxed in, you're in a straight place. You find no way to get out of. And all of a sudden, God comes and he knocks down those walls or those fences and places you in a large place, which actually spells what? Relief, right? How do you spell relief? Oh, Rolaids. I forgot that commercial. But anyway, God pops in a couple pills of Rolaids and you find some relief. You know what it is, that relief, right? A stomach ache, a headache, a sinus headache. You know what it's like, right? And God brings relief. And that's what God is there to do. In my distress, the next thing, I recognized that it was the Lord who was on my side. So not only really, what do we have here? We have a testimony of an individual. And he comes into the congregation, and it's a time of worship. And in the time of worship, they are speaking and singing about the mercies of God. And so we have an individual coming into the temple and say, hey, you know what? I got a testimony. Let me tell you what God did for me. And that's what you have in these verses. Hey, let me have your ear for a minute. I want to tell you something that God did for me. Wait, I always think if God did it for you, he can do it for me too, right? So the psalmist says, and he's basically calling us to say, hey, I want you to come over here. I want to tell you something. We come over there and he tells you something, and he says, I'm going to tell you what God did for me. What is it that God did for you? He says, well, I called upon the Lord in distress, and he answered me and put me in a large place. He said, I figured out that the Lord was on my side and that I will not fear. He says, what can man do unto me? He said, the Lord takes my part with them that help me. Therefore will I see my desire upon my enemies. In my distress, I recognized that it was the Lord who was on my side. Again, we see Paul's words that no man stood with me. Nevertheless, the Lord stood with me. Paul could say, along with the psalmist, the Lord is on my side. Not only did the psalmist say, the Lord is on my side, Paul could say, the Lord is on my side, but you can say as well, the Lord is on my side. And really, as we consider the fact that God is on our side, really two persons make the majority, you and God. If God is on your side, you don't need anyone else. A multitude could be against you, but with God all things are possible. Paul says in Romans chapter 8, if God be for us, and he is, if God be for us, who then can be against us? Because God is on my side, I will not fear. Because God is on my side, I will not fear. What is it that produces fear in our life? Well, there's many occasions for fear. There's the fear of men. There's the fear of the future. There's the fear of the unknown. There's all kinds of fears that come our way, and yet we are told not to fear. And so now, if I know that the Lord is on my side, it's going to do something with that trigger of fear in my life. That trigger of fear is there. I can tell you not to fear, but given the right circumstances, you will fear. If you're standing around the corner on a dark night and all of a sudden I say, boom, there's something's going to happen to you, right? The adrenaline is going to move a little bit. There's occasions where we face fear. To say, I will never fear again is not realistic. We will face the issue of fear. God says in the scripture 365 times, fear not. Wait, how do I solve the issue of fear in my life? I recognize that God is on my side. If God is on my side, there is no need for what? Fear. It extinguishes fear knowing that God is on my side. You're going through a scary area, right? 26th in California at night. Wait, guess what? God is on my side. There is no need for fear. We looked at a couple of weeks ago the general that goes into military battle, and he goes fearlessly because he says, you know what? The bullet that was meant for me hasn't even been made yet. So you go into battle recognizing, wait, God is on my side. Hey, whatever is going to happen is going to happen, right? Isn't God watching over you? Isn't God protecting you? Isn't God preserving you? Yeah. It's not going to end until God says it's the end, right? And so really, we can have confidence knowing that God is on our side. Because God is on my side, I will not fear. What can man do unto me? If God is for me, who then can be against me? The world could be against me, but if God is on my side, you and I are going to gain the victory. The psalmist says in Psalm 27, verse 1, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom then shall I be afraid? When the wicked, even mine enemies and my foes, came upon me, they stumbled and fell. Though an host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though an host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. The Lord is on my side. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? The fourth thing we see in this passage of Scripture is this. In my distress, I recognize that the Lord was my helper. In verse 7. The Lord hath taken my part with them that help me. Therefore shall I see my desire upon them that hate me. When God shows up, things begin to happen. When God shows up, things begin to change. And that's what he's saying here. God showed up. And guess when God shows up, there's going to be some rocking and rolling here when God shows up. Things are going to change. Not only is he on my side, he takes up the issues of life. And when he does, things start happening. I mean, when God does a work, you know what happens? It happens, right? When the Israelites were pressed up against the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's army was pursuing, and they were stressed out and distressed that they were going to face Pharaoh and his army, guess what happened? God began to work. And you know what? God began to work, and you know how he worked? He opened up the Red Sea, and they went across on dry ground. When God does a work, he's going to deliver you from your enemies. The knots of life get undone, okay? You got any knots in your life that need undone? Remember that? Trying to undo some knots? Some of those take a little time and some work to undo a knot. I remember, it must have looked strange, but I was trying to get a 100-foot hose out of a box. And somehow it wound itself around that wheel, one of those boxes, and you turn, and I don't know. To watch it probably would have been like one of those Three Stooges things, trying to get a hose out of a box, a 100-foot hose out of this box. Pulling this way, and tangle this way, and tangle that way. Finally got it out, but he can get the hose back out of the box. When God shows up, the enemy will be defeated. There's going to be a solution to your problems. And so, in closing, what do we see in this passage of Scripture? We see his afflictions and his supplication. We see that in the psalm that we've looked at. We see his afflictions and his supplications. God granting of his prayer and deliverance are visibly in his mind, and his faith contains him to be, propels him really to be a witness to the congregation of what God has done for him. In verse 6 and 7, he begins by speaking of the feelings of fearlessness and of trust in God as he sustains him. If God is for him, who can be against him? With God as his helper, he knows no fear of men. For what can man do to him when God appears to help him? What is someone going to do against you when God is on your side and he appears to help you? When man is no longer confronted by man, but by God himself. It's like taking your big brother to fight a bully, right? Remember, I had a bully in 7th grade, so I took my biggest friend, because I was like this, and he was like this, and that solved partially the problem of my bully in 7th and 8th grade. Brought my big friend that was in high school, and he came to meet me after school, okay? So when you're like this, and your friend shows up and he's like this, you know what, the bullies are all right. Okay, when you're like this and God shows up and he's all the way up to who knows where, no problem, right? When God shows up, there's a solution that is found for your problem. The fear of men diminishes in proportion to the consciousness of the greatness of God. And really anything in life, we looked at that in Psalm 91. The better we know God, the better we are able to deal with the issues of life. That's because we have a resource. We're not falling apart and coming undone at every issue of life. The better we know God, and the better we are able to recognize him and go there for our help, guess what? The sooner we will get help. And so does our trust in man. Is our trust in men and human help? No. Sometimes that human help fails. Again, in verse 1 through 4, he begins with the mercy of God. In verse 8 and 9, of his testimony. And then just briefly in 8 and 9, it says, it is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in princes. Here we have a general principle of practical wisdom that the psalmist expresses. Here we have truth based on personal experience. What is his personal experience? His personal experience is this. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. It is better to trust in the Lord than put confidence in princes. There is only one place where we can take our stand without ever being shaken, and that is at God's side. Genuine faith can only grow where man has completely ceased to trust in man, and when human support has broken down and trust in God has become the only living force. See, we don't depend upon man, and the more we cease to depend on man and depend on God, our faith in him will be growing. And so we have the testimony of an individual singing of the mercies of God, telling us his story and how faith was the answer to his great story. And as we leave here today, we recognize that we need to put our faith and trust in God. It is better to trust in the Lord. It is better to trust in the Lord than put confidence in man. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in princes. You think God is going to forsake you? You think God is going to leave you? You think he's just going to say, hey, you're on your own, like the kid, right? Like he's got 3 graduates out of college, right? Don't come back here, the sign's up. Even though he's not moving, he has a sign in front of his house for sale. So they don't come back, right? But guess what? It's not going to be like that. It's not going to be, hey, you're 18, you're out of here. Oh, you're a graduate from college? your room's my gaming room now, right? It's not like that, right? Does God say, okay, you're 18 now, you're out of here. You're 21, you're out of here. No, you're 110 and you're still in, right? Guess what? This guy's never going to leave home, right? So his parents are 200 and he's still 110, he's still living at home. Oh my God, when is this guy going to move out? God never says, when is this guy going to move out? You're welcome, okay? God's going to answer, he's going to solve your problems, he's going to be there for you when? All the days of your life. And what is the basic, let's get down to the basic principle here. What is it? Trust in God. Trust in God. Don't trust in man, trust in God. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you once again for your goodness and mercies to us. We thank you for your word, which brings strength and encouragement to us. Again, we want to put our faith and trust in you in all the issues of life. And we pray that we might